Cinema affects not only what we see, but how we see it. The most powerful films are those that transform our perception, the ones that profoundly alter the way we encounter the world. This is how I experience Dreams Are Colder Than Death. As a work not only of art, but a record of contemporary thought around issues of blackness, it changes the way I am in the world, literally altering the way I see it. I can say the same of the writings of Saidiya Hartman. Her work, interrogating the historical record and reinterpreting archival sources to produce new histories, has been profoundly influential on the way I understand the present and my place in it. Her presence in the film tonight and her contribution to it are for me a large part of its richness and power. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of hearing AJ discuss his installation, Love is the Message is Death, with a group of high school students. Towards the end of the discussion, he said that one of the functions or values of art is that it can, quote, teach other people to identify with us, to create opportunities for exercising the muscle of identification. And he also said that his particular aesthetic, the way he creates and assembles images, is in part a response to the question, how do we make a black cinema with the power, beauty, and alienation of black music? Dreams Are Colder Than Death also begins with a set of questions. And I think the centrality of using a question as a strategy in this practice cannot be overstated. Perhaps that is what makes Dreams so powerful, that it is just as much about the questioning, the investigation into something like what is blackness, as it is about the answers. Now, in the 21st century, we require our thinking to be above all functional, but we must never forget that questioning and ultimately redefining beauty, or as Fanon might have put it, revaluing all values, is one of the essential functions of art and philosophy. And to think in a way that bears the weight of our existence, and when necessary, creates a new form for it, is one of the most vital roles any contemporary artist or thinker can fill. And by this measure, we have two of the most important and profoundly relevant thinkers with us this evening. Saidiya Hartman is a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University and the author of Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, and Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in the 19th Century America. She's currently at work on a new book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which examines the sexual upheaval and radical transformation of everyday life that took place in cities in the earliest part of the 20th century. And Arthur Jaffa is a visual artist based in New York. He studied at Howard University, where he met his mentor, Haile Garima, who introduced him to some of the leading figures of what's come to be known as the Los Angeles Rebellion, including Charles Burnett, who we'll also see in the film tonight, and Julie Dash. And he's worked on many important films, including Burnett's My Brother's Wedding, Dash's Daughters of the Dust, Spike Lee's Crooklyn's, John O'Confer's 7 Songs from Malcolm X, and many, many, many more. In addition to his filmmaking practice, he has also worked in a variety of media, recently turning more intensely towards installation, a fabulous example of which is in the galleries right now. So after the screening, Jaffa and Hartman will come up to discuss their work, unless there's any remarks that they'd like to make right now.
We've been riding around in a car together all afternoon. But I want to start off with a question about dreams and ask you about the ways in which it is not a documentary or challenges what a documentary is. And I want you to address that in at least two ways. One, reading of the film, which might be a misreading, would be,
Reading that.
Okay.
I'm not the only one controlling the sound.
Okay, so
No, I don't want to.
I don't want to hold mic.
I might drop.
And I guess, I'm struck by two things. I mean, it's not simply like a documentary of you recording, a range of thinkers about what the meaning of blackness is, as much as it is you curating and trying to, I guess, assemble, as I'm reading it, a certain set of propositions around blackness. And those propositions are actually very, very different. So I want you to kind of say more about the statement that's created through this various set of propositions on one hand. And then the second part of the question is, in making this, you were also involved in a kind of critical practice, and a critical practice that was challenging the centrality of the white gaze in the cinematic apparatus, and actually trying to grasp, to illuminate, to record other expressive modalities. And I want you to talk about the relationship between those other expressive modalities and the kinds of things that can be said and imagined about blackness.
Wow, that's a lot. Keep it all in my head. Well, I guess maybe I just start a little bit talking about the process, because I think the process is bound up. Well, the context in which the project came into being was an associate of mine, Khalil Joseph, was approached by Asa Mater, who was one of the producers on the project, about he had been asked, Asa, who was an American, who was based in Paris, had been asked to do a documentary on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. They had 2 nights of programming done, and it was like Killer Sheep, Do the Right Thing. There were quite a few things, but they had this slot for this, what was going to be a look back at the March on Washington. And they approached Khalil, and I think Khalil was, I don't know, he wasn't that interested, or I don't say, even thinking back, I think someone was generational maybe or something, but he kind of handed it off to me. And I just looked at it, and I was like, I don't think I want to do this either. I was like, and I actually ended up talking to Asa, and I think I said to him something like, I'm really not interested in doing anything about the March on Washington, looking back at it. And I was like, plus I actually think I've seen that on PBS, haven't I? I've seen that film maybe twice, 2 or 3 times. And then he said, well, what would you want to do? And my immediate response was just, I'm just interested in doing something about where black people are at now. It was like pretty straightforward. And he said, well, what would that be? And then that's when it sort of, it opened up into this more sort of complicated kind of space. The way I framed it for ZDF, the Germans, was that I said I want to do something that's about the afterlife of the March on Washington. Because at the time in particular, we were sort of in the middle of what, some people were saying was a golden age. We had a black president and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, well, in my circle, it don't seem like no golden age. And I was like, nobody seems happy even, I was like, nobody was really seeming too happy. So, at a certain point, I just, I think there's 2 types of work I know I'm really preoccupied with now. I've come to understand them, conceptually framing in a certain kind of way. One work is what I call Doro work. And Doro is like, in Octavia Butler. It's just like, and if anybody knows Octavia Butler, this character she wrote, Doro, is the most intense character she ever wrote. He's basically like a black spirit who's obsessed with like a kind of his ongoing eugenics program or something. He's forcefully interbreeding black people to try to create this body for himself. So when I say Dora works, I'm meaning basically I'm very preoccupied with the whole idea of bringing things together to create new things, whether those things are consensual or not. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I'm really preoccupied is what I call is usher work. And usher work is work that's really preoccupied with creating platforms for other things or other people, to sort of speak. And so I think this project was definitely one that I thought of in those terms, like when I said, where black people at, well, the question becomes like, how do you render that? How do you render this whole notion of where black people are at? Is it simply what black people say, or where they say they're at, or is there another way that you can actually effectively sort of signify, or as I said, render where they're at? And this sort of goes to the second question I'm gonna try to loop back through the 2 of them, is, and the one thing that I thought about a lot, like as a model too, in addition to this like tension between Dora work and usher work, was that there's this book that had a big impact on me, Dry Long So by John Gwaltney. Really incredible book. It's Dry Long So, a portrait of Afro-America, or Black America maybe. So, and it's essentially a series of interviews he did with people, testimonials. And it's just super striking. It's like super striking. I've read a lot of books, you know, of testimonials and stuff, but there's something really, really particular about this thing in terms of the quality of frankness, I would say. It's like one of the most beautiful and kind of truest written documents I've ever seen of how Black people actually sound when they're thinking. But I was always struck in the introduction by something that he said. He said that he felt like one of the real reasons that he was able to elicit from people the type of testimonies that he did, he thought it was inextricably bound up with the fact that he was blind, that he couldn't see. And I mean, I literally thought about this for 20, 30 years, like this whole idea of the testimonial and being blind, the blind interviewer. And over the years, I sort of evolved this notion. I don't even know if it's a theory so much, it's like a notion, kind of this notion that if you point a camera at Black people, it triggers a series of what are essentially survival modalities that really have to do with being masked in a way. Like what kinds of things you can say. Like in other words, the camera ends up being an instrument that's streaming the white gaze. It's like the camera ends up functioning as a sort of, on a psychoanalytical level, as a stand-in for the white gaze. And whenever Black people are subjected to the white gaze, there's this whole series of really protective and survival things in terms of what you can and cannot say. So the question was like, how do you get around that? So I thought John Gwaltney's observation was completely bound up in that. It's something about not being seen, freeing Black people up to speak freely. So one of the first things that I decided in this project was that I was never going to point a camera at people when I talked to them. And that actually allowed, I think, for a lot of the nature of the sort of testimonials that people gave, but it also presented some very interesting formal problems of formal possibilities. You know, it's funny, like Greg Tate, friend, he said, he's pointed out a couple times, he said oftentimes when he's seeing the film with the audience, he would ask them what they thought about the fact that there are no talking heads in it. There are a lot of heads, but they're not talking. And he said, people say, what are you talking about? That people would actually experience it as if people were actually speaking. In fact, even though you never see anybody's lips speaking in sync, you know. And so for me, like that, like I said, there's something about this disjunction of the sound. Like to me, it's something about just hearing the voices as being like a kind of collective sub-vocal articulation and the way they float around and stuff. On one hand, is just foregrounding Black people's subjectivity to me. That's what I think. I think it's really it's creating an effect whereby you get this sense that you actually are cutting to the bone of the matter, right? Now, procedurally, and you know this too from being, participating in the project. Like people were asking me, like interview people. I was like, well, I don't think I interviewed anybody actually. In fact, my sort of strategy, so to speak, was to, like I said, turn the camera away, off, out of the way, set up the recording thing, and just start talking to people. And I would basically kind of say, this is supposed to be a golden age, but we don't seem happy. What do you think? And most people would talk hours, in a couple of instances, 2 or 3 hours. Most people take them about an hour to talk themselves out. Tell me what they think. And we smart, so we think some really interesting shit, right? So I'd just be listening. And it was an exercise in discipline too, because I know everybody who knows me knows I'm a big blabber, so I had to be very disciplined to keep my mouth shut, right? So, in this sense, anybody who's been in therapy knows the drill. You sit there and you don't say anything, and it creates a kind of horror vacuum where people feel compelled to fill that empty space. So generally me and one other person, it seemed to work better if there was a kind of triangulation that was happening, meaning not just the person who was speaking, but me and somebody else. It seemed to work better. People would just tell me what they think, I'd say it very, very, very little. And then when people had kind of told me what they thought, I generally would take a moment, then I would say, okay, now you told me what you thought, take a second now and tell me what you know. And most people would stop them. Some people would say, like, what do you mean? What's the difference between the two? Or some people would just stop and think about it. And I would most people took a few minutes before they reoriented themselves. But a few people, they would just walk away. I know Hortense, she walked away for 20 and 30 minutes and came back and started up again. And so it's a strategy on one hand to sort of joke people out of that. When people would ask me, if they asked me, what's the difference between what you think and what you know, I would say always, well, thinking to me is always in process. Because you can think something one day and think something totally different the next day, right? But all thinking is on the way to becoming something you either know to be true or you know not to be true. Once you know it, it's it goes into this other place. It's not to say that it can't, as we know in life, there's something you can know and you can find out that you really didn't know it. You thought you knew it, but it wasn't the case. But I think it just set up this kind of structure that would allow people to return to, in some ways, many of the things that they had said, but from a different vantage. So a lot of the rhetorical framework of the film was built specifically around people saying what they think versus what they know. So when Fred is going back and forth, well, I know this, but what I think is this, and I think this, but what I really know is this. Or Hortense, who tells us all these incredible things that she thinks, and in the end, she comes back, but what I know is I'm gonna lose everybody, And in a sense, I think because they're this super, super loose, but at the same time, very specific stratagem, what I think it kind of did was, and this is in hindsight, now this is not, this is me just having thought about it from 4 years ago. I think it kind of corralled people into a way so that it stacked the folks that I talked to, it stacked people's experiences as certain thematics started to present themselves over and over.
I'm going to ask the second
Okay.
question.
I don't even know if I answered these.
And it's precisely about this thing about what it is we know. And I think in the film, something comes up that's very powerful. I mean, Hortense opens talking about, this incredible gift of Black culture. But when we get to what we know, I was thinking about what we know. Some might say what we know is about this kind of deep interconnection, this deep intimacy that Blackness has with death. Mm-hmm. And basically that's the note Hortense ends on. And then what Fred knows is Blackness and its kind of generative capacity, and a Blackness that's not predicated, like Fanon, by a kind of ontological negation. Mm-hmm. So I want you, and that is kind of the critical nexus, I feel, also of Black studies at this moment,
exactly.
Right? And even in the book about love is the message, Christina Sharp quotes Fred to say, well, no, but I think Blackness is produced by horror and terror, mm-hmm. But there is this thing that then exceeds it. But I want to ask you about that, the way those two things are kind of inextricably linked, and how that structures your work. Because so I don't know if you want to say more about those, I think of it as kind of, social death theory and Black vitalism being in this kind of mutual relation, but it seems that in your cinematic practice, you're also always thinking about the kind of making that happens in the whole or in the space of creation. What is it that this dispossessive force produces? Mm-hmm.
It's funny, it's I'm not, it's funny to say, I'm not an academic per se. And a lot of the whole, the discourse around Afro-ops and Afro-pessimists was a discourse in terms of the terms I wasn't aware of when I started on the film. But I was completely bound up in these ideas, the tension between ideas, it's like two things. I remember there was a moment when we were editing the film, and one of my editors turned to me and he's like, man, why do we have all this death in this film, you know? Like, he's like, what's so black about this? What's so black about this? Everybody dies. Why is this so specifically black? And I just turned to him right in the moment, and it's one of those instances where you say exactly what you think in the moment, you don't think about it afterwards. I say, look, I'm interested in at least two things. I'm interested in the experience of black people, but I'm also interested in the black experience. They're not the same things. They have a complex relationship with you know, with each other, but they're not really quite the same things. And so it's something about this whole sense, and this goes to the Du Bois kind of thing of the double consciousness, or as I like to say, not trouble consciousness. I think it's more than just, you know, two looking at it in a binary kind of way. It's like a kind of, I've termed it a kind of stereoscopic cognition. It's like there's sort of a kind of cognitive depth perception that happens around ideas and stuff when you are forced to look at these ideas from two multiple vantage points, right? There's something else that happens. And so I think, like, even this whole question of blackness, which I think everybody is kind of, people who came of age or were coming of age in the 60s, really kind of in ways who came of age in the 70s, really in the right aftermath of the 60s, who could kind of remember it. Like, I literally remember James Brown being on the radio saying, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud," and it was the thing. Like, it was a meme, you know? Like, for real. It was like, and this is in Clarksville, Mississippi. It was a meme. It was like going around, like, wow, say it loud, I'm like, wow, you know, that's wow. You know, so I remember that really clearly, but in the 70s, things got very fuzzy, you know what I mean? In a sense, like, I think we moved from sort of a black power, we moved from civil rights to a black power conception, and then we moved into what people call black consciousness, which I think was the beginning of all of this preoccupation with ontological nature of blackness, like what is it at the end of the day? And I think, like, I remember I was just talking to Greg the other day, and I was saying to him, wow, you remember, like, I can remember being in New York, like, in 80, maybe 84, 85, and it was the first time I ever, like, you know, gave a public talk. I was on they had this conference called Show the Right Thing. You know, it was around Spike's work and Black Simmons stuff, and I was on this panel with Cornell West, Bell Hooks, and David Wong, and I was nervous, to say the least. I remember, like, trembling and looking over at David Wong's hand, and his hands were like jittering, like I had to look away from his hands, right? But I remember saying a lot of things, many of which people just like screamed at me. I can remember literally being screamed at. Like, I remember I said, we might be, I'm saying might be, I said we are, I said, I think we're the victims of integration, and people yelled from the floor. I said maybe the Middle Passage was the emancipatory moment. People screamed from the floor, like, that is blasphemy what you're saying now. But I think it was the beginning of starting to contend with, you know, we achieved certain legislative objectives, let's say, and we realized we weren't free. Like, you can be free on the books and still not be free. You can be free to move around and not be free in your heart, in your being, and that being free was not something that was going to happen because we got declared free, or we even declared ourselves free, that several hundred years of slavery and torture and stuff had an afterlife that wasn't going anywhere in our lifetime. I will never see the end of it. I don't think my kids will ever see the end of it, right? And so there's a kind of melancholy, I think, that set in collectively in the black community. I mean, if it could have engaged, so to speak, I do feel like in the late 70s, going to the 80s and stuff, there was a deep-seated collective melancholy that set in as people started to realize, wow, we accomplished so much of what we said the objective was, and it didn't cure us, right? So it became a really complicated, and I think this tension between Afro-pessimists and Afro-optimists and stuff is all, it's becoming a more focused articulation of these tensions. Like, you know, I love me some Fred Moten, right? But I don't agree with Fred. I never agreed with Fred about the horror thing. I think black being is inextricably bound up with horror. I don't think we can get around it. I think, like, in the science fiction alternate universe sense, it's just like, if a supreme deity said you could snap your finger and every horrible thing that ever happened to black people, or even just a third of the horrible things that happen to black people, you could snap their finger and they wouldn't happen. None of us exist. We erase ourselves. So that's like a profound dilemma on an ontological level. That's a profound dilemma. So, like, for me, I'm really interested in, like, how do we get at that, you know? And part of getting at that to me is what I've come to just term, like, you know, how do we destroy linear thinking? Like, how do we destroy a kind of associative thinking? Like the person who did it, you know, I was saying this earlier, who did it really, like, incredibly, like, recently was Dave Chappelle, you know, like, he has these 2 new things on Netflix, right? And at the end of the first one, he ends on this moment, not to spoil it or anything, but it's not really funny. He's not even trying to be funny in this moment. He just drops the mask of trying to be funny. He just says, Bill Cosby, he did incredible works for black people. Gave money to HBU, you know, I can never say that, but historically black colleges did this. I mean, look, I remember Bill Cosby when I was 5 years old when he was on I Spy. He was incandescent. He was amazing. Like, you had never seen a black man. He was like, you had the white guy, and that guy was an afterthought. And Bill Cosby had been put in that show as you know, like, oh, let's be radical. We're gonna put this black guy in here. He was clearly smarter than the guy, sexier than the guy, sharper than the guy. He was better than Robert Culp on every level, right? And I never forgot that. That made a real impression, you know, on me when I was a kid and stuff. And then Fat Albert, right? Incredible. Fat Albert is incredible. His early show where he was a high school teacher, incredible, right? The Cosby Show, amazing, amazing. And he's a rapist, too. Those 2 things are both true, right? And so, like, to me, the whole thing is like, the flip side of that is we think because we have a black president that they're gonna be in our interests. It's a kind of linear thinking, like the good guys have the white hats and the bad guys have the black hats. We know it's not like that in the world. So how do we disabuse ourselves of that?
I'm not going to touch Cosby, but I'm going to try to.
No, it's nothing to touch. He's a rapist, he's a monster, and he did some incredibly good shit.
I'm still not going to touch Cosby.
Okay.
But I guess in terms of, though, that, you know, what you're calling attention, you know, to, in a way it's related, I would say, to your film practice. And I guess there are these, I don't want to call them dyads, but maybe someone might call them like repeating bodies, right? Or repeating figures or linked figures in the work. And, you know, there's fall and flight is, as one said, there's terror and beauty, and then there are certain kinds of images that are also recurring. So maybe we have Gordon, the Private Gordon with the scourged back. And then we usually also kind of like have these beautiful stills from a killer of sheep. So I don't know if you would to say what's built around those coupled
Things that
images.
repeat.
Yeah, they're repeating, and again, it's not as if maybe they're kind of mutually constitutive, you know, the relationship between, in love, all the kind of the falling bodies, but bodies that are.
Well, I had this project that I've been working on for a while. It's called Apex. And the thing is, what I love about the term itself, Apex, is like, it's that moment when the thing is no longer rising, but it hasn't yet started to fall. It's like the thing being in that moment. That moment, I think, is bound up to this thing that I've termed troubled consciousness. It's like the ability to be able to see a thing three-dimensionally in its full complexity. I mean, that's all I'm trying to get at when I say the Cosby thing. It's not about, it's like it can be anything. So certain images to me, and I don't think this is all of those images, but I think certain images to me, they do that in a profound way. Like, I have been obsessed with the ex-slave Gordon, that image since I was 17, maybe 16 to 17 years old, pretty consciously obsessed with it. I remember sitting in the tech office at UCLA when Billy Woodbury used to hold court up at UCLA in the tech office and having that image and whipping out and saying, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The builders said, "Hold it now, hold it, youngster. What do you mean by that?" You know, and they just stopped me and I was forced. But it's something about how that image on one hand is maybe in some ways the single most object rendering. Not that you can reduce the horror part of the Black experience into one image, but damn, I don't know if we can do much better than that image in terms of like a sign of objection, like on his back, those marks, right? But at the same time, the dude has this incredible, almost aristocratic dignity. And it's the tension between the two. Like, is this a sign of our objection or our majesty? And to me, it's something about Black being where the misery is what Wesley Brown called tragic magic. It's like the misery and the magnificence are inextricably bound up. So that, to me, the ex-slave Gordon image is an image of that. Now, in terms of Charles' work, in terms of Killer Sheep, I just find like that film, even just that film in particular, to be the most exquisite rendering of this quality in Black social life. I don't know that anybody's made a film that really kind of gets at it with the nuance and complexity, of that. Like from the very first scene in the film, it's like, the father's like, "Son, you coming here with this crazy shit? Somebody else started some fight with your brother and you standing back watching it?" And you know what I mean? And like, "You gotta get in there and fight, right? I don't wanna hear no dumb shit." And basically the young cat is just being a critical thinker. He's saying like, "Yeah, I'm not just gonna react because it's my brother, I'm just gonna jump in and pile in and fight." But his father is also saying to him like, "Yo, that's the only person who has your back in the world." And then there's this moment when the mom is standing there with the other, the kid, his younger brother, I guess, and you don't know, you can't tell in that moment whether the mom is like feeling bad because the father's lambasted. She goes over and slaps her son, bam, and it's just something about that. Like, what does it mean for a loving mother to slap the shit out of you? Like, that to me seems so bound up in what Blackness kind of is, It's like in Love Is a Message when the father has the son's hands on the wall. Like when I first saw that, I was floored by that. I was like, I understood where it was coming from, but I was like, "Yo, you're going too far, man." Because like, it's like when I was growing up, same thing. My grandmother, "Don't cross that street without looking or I'll kill you." Everybody knows that, right? So I think it's something paradoxical, I think, about it. It's like when Fred says, and he, I think, is reformulating Frank Wilson about the nature of the whole, the slave ship, is that it's the place where we were the most bound up, but inextricably, almost, paradoxically, it's also the place where the imaginative capacities were unleashed, When Black people came here as slaves, when we were enslaved in the Middle Passage, like a lot of really complicated things happened, like one of which, say for example, is at the same time, like when I talk about the Black music thing, which is, a big central organizing trope for me around the cinema thing, and people have asked me like, why Black music? Well, we could talk for a week just about Black music alone, but one thing I would say about Black music, I would say, the proof is in the pudding. It's the one place where everybody agrees, Black people and not Black people, that we did something pretty magnificent. So that's one level of it. But beyond that is the question always asked, but why? Why is that? Well, how do we account for the magnificence? And this is a big generalization of Black music. How do we account for it? Well, one of the things I would say is this, is that, and this is my reading of it, but I feel like in the natal context, in the traditional context, a lot of African music is royal music. Meaning like it's music, in the same way if you look at painting, it occupies an almost similar cultural position that painting does in the Western cultural formation and stuff. Like if you go to the Louvre and look at painting, the majority of it is religious painting, right? Or it's the kings and queens. It's like whatever the power structure was that could subsidize the practice of a particular thing, in this instance rendering the ruling class, right? Which would either be the church or the kings and queens, right? a lot of music in Africa is like that. It's royal music. It's like, even when you talk about griots, most of the griots are not singing about the common man. They're singing about the great heroes of Africa and stuff. And like I always make this joke that, you know, we're not, even though we all had those ebony posters, the kings and queens of Africa, we're not the progeny of the kings and queens of Africa, because we wouldn't fucking be here, by and large. Hold up, let me just, I know you're gonna cut me off. I just wanna finish this stuff, because I know I'm rambling, but I just wanna finish it. So the thing about the music, to me, I think one of the main reason the music is so powerful is because oldest musical tradition on the face of the earth, out of Africa, right? We bring these musical things with us on the slave ships, and very paradoxically, even though our physical being is radically constrained, the music is unleashed. It's almost like when they say AIDS happened when the AIDS virus leaped the species barrier. You know what I mean? It leaped from being in monkeys to being in human beings, and when it leaped into human beings, there was no natural predation. There was nothing that could stop it, in a sense. So I think what happened with black music is you got this incredibly rich musical tradition, sophistication, right, that's been singing these songs of the ruling class. We bring these songs with us to the Americas, and there's no ruling class. We are all fixed in the lower depths of class structure, right? So all of a sudden, we bring to bear this incredibly rich musical tradition on working class experiences or peasant class experiences. And not just any peasant class experiences, but peasants in the most radically dramatic circumstances, maybe one of the most radically dramatic circumstances that any group of people ever found itself in the history of mankind. That's why black music is powerful, right? Because it's that incredible structure and capacity focused on super dramatic circumstances, which is why I'm interested in cinema, because I think same thing. We can bring to bear those same types of problematics and possibilities or potentiality in the space of cinema.
And on that note, I don't know if you want to go to the audience or if we should have one more.
Oh, should I show something? Let me show one thing.
Okay.
That's all right. I mean, only because I don't want people to walk away thinking it's all doom and gloom. So maybe, can you guys hear me up there?
Yeah.
Okay, Kylie, what should I show? The Nick, should I show the Frank Ocean or should I show the Sharifa Wallace?
Frank Ocean.
Okay, it's called Crystal and Nick. Oh, hold up, let us move.